evening, everybody. It is now officially 6 o'clock, so I think we're going to get started because it's incredible how quickly that hour can go. So thank you to everyone who has tuned in this evening and taken time out of your day to join us. We do hope there's going to be of some value this evening. I'm just going to give a very brief introduction into what we're going to be discussing tonight, so you are aware of likely what's ahead of us in the next hour or so. So again, as I say, welcome everyone to our Ask the Experts panel discussion, which we are going to be focusing on managing anxiety as a topic this evening. Blood cancer, as we know, can bring so many different challenges, and we hear of many people who at times struggle with emotional impact, which blood cancer can bring, understandably. We'll be talking through and answering some of the questions we hear commonly over our support line, but also questions that you as a community have already submitted via our online forum. Feel free to put questions below as we go along. The conversation will be continued over on our forum, so don't hesitate to head there afterwards. And also, just to add to that, we really appreciate that some of the conversation and topics this evening will be really quite difficult for some people. So do remember that we ourselves, the support line here at Blood Cancer UK, are open again tomorrow, starting at 10 AM and closing until 4 PM. And we actually have a 7-day-a-week service. We'll pop our details in the comments below, but you can reach us on 0808 2080 888. Failing that, if anything is quite triggering this evening and you just feel that you need to talk immediately or at any point throughout the night, please do contact the Samaritans, as they are 24 hours. So I will not hold back any further, and I'll come and do a very brief introduction of all our wonderful panel members that we have with us this evening. But firstly, a very big thank you for you all in giving your time. It is hugely appreciated, and I think everyone will agree that we've got a really brilliant panel this evening of really good mixed kind of experience, expertise, which hopefully people can relate to from some way or another. So I've spoken enough. I'll just very briefly introduce myself. My name is Lauren, and I am one of the nurses within the support service here at Blood Cancer UK. And I'm here tonight with my lovely colleague Gemma, who I'll hand over to for an introduction as well.
Thanks so much, Lauren. Yes, I'm Gemma. I'm also one of the nurses here at Blood Cancer UK, and I work in the support services team. So you'll see that we work on the phone line and emails and social media and the community forum. So we're pretty much everywhere across the support services. So I will now pass you over to Jonathan.
Thanks, Gemma. I'm Jonathan. I'm a counsellor, supervisor and trainer, and I've worked in various supportive clinical roles, but mainly focused on life-threatening illness, particularly cancer, loss, dying and bereavement. And what that means is I've worked with and heard many, many stories from patients, families and friends impacted by cancer, which I'll draw on as we speak later today. Thank you. And over to you, Cecilia.
Thanks, Jonathan. I'm Cecilia. I'm here as a blood cancer patient. I was diagnosed in September 2020 with myeloma. And so I've been through the initial treatment, the stem cell transplant in 2021, and I'm now in a sort of period of stability on maintenance medication. So I'm coming from a personal experience of having gone through all of these various stages and still being and continuing my journey with blood cancer. And I also run a support group for Myeloma UK for people in their 50s and younger with myeloma, because generally speaking, it's usually diagnosed in much older patients. So this is about getting a sort of younger group together, provide support to each other. So much like Jonathan, I'm going to draw from my experience having, you know, those monthly support group meetings as well. Thanks. I'll hand over to Peter.
Hi, everybody. I'm Peter, and I'm also a blood cancer patient. In my case, I've got myelodysplasia, and specifically the problem I have is with my white blood cell count. Currently, or actually have since late 2017, been on supportive treatment, which is bi-weekly injections of filgrastim to try and maintain my white blood cell count at a manageable level. I've had a couple of spells in hospital though as a result of developing infections, including some rather challenging times, but overall doing well. Glad to be here and glad to be part of this wider group. So I think I think that's everybody now that's been covered.
That's everybody. Yay, that was fabulous. We're doing well with our timekeeping this evening, so thank you for that. So as you can see, it's a really brilliant panel this evening, and the hope is that it does feel relatable on some aspects. But I wondered if we could maybe start just emphasising the fact that we chose to do the topic of anxiety this week. I think that's really well, because it happens to be Mental Health Awareness Week as well. So there is a little bit of kind of buzz around caring for ourselves, looking after ourselves. What is mental health? Jonathan, could I possibly come to you and just ask for your insight and explanation of what anxiety is and what we can really relate to when it comes to anxiety?
Thank you. Before I speak, I better just say, if I look up, I'm not seeking divine inspiration. It's just I have got a few notes just in case I forgot things I might say, which happen to be above the screen. But I mean, basically, I think anxiety is incredibly relevant, because if you have a diagnosis of blood cancer, any blood cancer, whether it's our own diagnosis or for someone who matters to us, can naturally make us feel very anxious. And it can mean living with fear, and even after treatment, living with constant uncertainty. And I'm sure this will all get illustrated as we go through the session. But I want to reinforce that anxiety is a natural human reaction when we feel threatened. It's perfectly normal, but we can experience it in lots of different ways. It might be how we feel, it might be how we think, and it might literally be something physical around our body. It's like, I think we're all familiar with our stomach turning. When something happens, we can have those kinds of reactions. So it affects us in many, many different ways. And the people watching us when we're anxious may interpret it in many different ways. But anxiety can get a bad press. People will say, like, oh, stop being so anxious, stop worrying, which I have to say is particularly unhelpful and, dare I say, stupid in a session like this, but a stupid thing to say. Because actually anxiety is a necessary part of being alive. If we didn't have anxiety, we wouldn't be aware of danger and we wouldn't take the actions we need to reduce it. I think the challenge with something like cancer is we're not always able to acknowledge and recognize and find actions that we can take. It's sometimes about how do we live with it. And dealing with anxiety can be complex. It's especially so because other people may not understand our anxiety. So as an example, if a doctor says there's a 90% probability that your cancer will not return, a family member will think that's a cause for celebration and say, isn't it wonderful that you must feel great? But for the person who has had an experience of cancer, whether it's going to come back or in remission or whatever, they can often think and feel that they are going to be in the 10% because I've had it, therefore I can get it. And no 90% probability means anything. But it's that mismatch that can be really difficult for people to handle because other people don't understand your anxiety. And that's why I would argue that, or suggest that sharing your anxiety is a huge step towards dealing with it. It helps other people to understand what it is that you're worrying about, perhaps. And it also helps people understand how they might come alongside you with that understanding and simply be there as you deal with it and live with it. And one last thing before I hand over back to Lauren. One last thing is just what came to mind when I was thinking about this. I don't know if people are familiar, but certainly I'm old enough to remember very old-fashioned cartoons where there would be the animal, let's say that's the animal, and there would be the tree, and the tree would start to fall. And the animal would see the threat, would be afraid, and would run away from the threat. But because they were running away from the threat, there was a much longer time for the tree to fall on them. Whereas in reality, if we can just take one small step, just take a breath, take one small step to the side, we can see the tree falling, but we're standing safely next to it. And there is something about not letting anxiety be the fear that we run away from. Let's step just one small step away and look at it, and then we can work out what to do with it. I hope that makes some sense. And that's me for now.
That makes perfect sense. And I think there'll be many people out there that it's so lovely to hear how you are able to kind of spin these thoughts and fears on its head and have a picture, I think, for maybe an understanding of anxiety, to almost normalize it, because I think it's very much, it's a feeling and a fear, and it's something we all have within us, but it peaks and it troughs. And when you are living with, just about to be diagnosed, affected by, worried about blood cancer, we know that certainly through what we do here within the organisation, is that's where we hear about a huge amount of anxiety, and we'll come on to talk about very different topics. But I wondered if we could kind of segment quite nicely into just that, and ask maybe perhaps Peter and Cecilia to come in and just maybe, you know, when we look at coping with anxiety, when you are perhaps at the start, should I say, of your diagnosis, or even before that, where you know you have something not quite happy in your bloods, but you've not quite been able to identify what's happening there. So maybe you're waiting for haematology input for your first appointment. Maybe you've been on Dr. Google. There are many other search engines available, but we know that sometimes that really feeds into that already kind of simmering anxiety. How did you and how do you cope with that anxiety? And do you have anything that you can provide people watching tonight with, any tips or ideas about if you are newly diagnosed or worried about blood cancer, what helped you?
Do you want me to maybe come in first, if that's okay with you, Cecilia?
Absolutely fine. Yeah.
You know, from my perspective, it was building up among a number of appointments, because there was a lack of clarity as to why my white blood cell counts were low, and it had been like this for quite a while. And various tests were done, and then ultimately I had the bone marrow biopsy. And initially it looked like there weren't too many blasts in the first appointment I went after having the biopsy. And I thought, oh, so it'll be an idiopathic or a random neutropenia I was suffering from. And then I went to the subsequent appointment, and actually the consultant came out to get me. So I thought, that's interesting. Usually I'm called by one of the nurses. And they told me that they found the genetic abnormality, and they now were clear that I had myelodysplasia. So that was just a word to me, and immediately the scientist in me kicked in and said, right, where shall I find out information about this? What I did was I had an appointment the following week. I wrote a list of questions. I was very careful in going on to Google, because there is an absolute proliferation of information out there, and not all of it is relevant. So I was particular about going on to what I felt were appropriate sites, either scientific literature, which can be quite complicated for people who are non-scientists, but I was aware of the likes of Blood Cancer UK, Macmillan, and there was actually an MDS support group, because there'd been literature lying around the hospital about these groups. So I thought that's probably the best place for me to go and look. So I started gathering information there. I must admit, with the scientist in me, I was sort of very interested in trying to find out so much before, and maybe I was doing a bit of displacement activity about that, trying to gather information and using that maybe to suppress the anxiety. Before handing over to Cecilia, though, I would say I had a period of hospitalization shortly after my diagnosis, and I was quite ill at that point. And I found post that I started getting involved in a lot of displacement activities. I knew there was something not quite right, so I decided to get counselling, and my employer were phenomenal. they put everything in place for me very quickly when there was waiting lists that for the usual sources. And that was hugely supportive because I was able to go and talk to somebody and was picking up what Jonathan said. Sharing this was quite important. But one thing I would say is I couldn't share it necessarily with everybody close to me because some of the things I was thinking about involved them, and it was difficult. Sorry, this is typical, slightly left of field, these things, Tom. So when I got talking to a professional counsellor, that was phenomenally supportive, and 10 sessions where I could just go into that room and do everything from vent to actually just know I was there in a non-judgmental area was hugely supportive. The other thing I found fantastic was actually the Blood Cancer Forum. I got on, was able to talk to people who'd been through what I was going through, and it was fantastic because it was non-judgmental and just hugely supportive. So my apologies, maybe I've talked a little bit long there. So Celia, I'll hand over to you.
No, thank you, Peter. I think what you mentioned briefly there, for me, the big thing was educating myself. That does help really, because when I was diagnosed, I'd never heard of myeloma. So that was a new one on me. I was like, okay, you hear of leukemia and other blood cancers, but this was one I'd never heard before. So for me, it was a bit, taking some time going to places like Blood Cancer UK, Myeloma UK, where they've got many booklets. I actually ordered a whole bunch of them to physical copies. And I did it at my own pace, reading it, because you don't want to overwhelm yourself either, but you just want to have a bit of an understanding. So for me, that gave me a sense of control because I could have a good conversation with my consultant, not you're just telling me this stuff and it doesn't mean anything to me. For me, that's very important. So that helps, the reading the newly diagnosed booklet and just trying, very much like Jonathan, to step aside rather than running from that falling tree to, seeing it coming down on you, taking a moment to, between when they, they thought initially that it was non-Hodgkin's lymphoma for me because it had come through as enlarged lymph nodes and which is a bit unusual for myeloma. So, in that time, they did a lymph node biopsy, and then you've got to wait because that, that's got to go to the lab and it needs to have the right stuff done, or tests, and before they can give that proper diagnosis. And that time, that 2 weeks was the longest 2 weeks because I hadn't told any of my family. I don't want them worrying as well about something that might not actually happen. But for me, you just want to go and talk to your mum or talk to somebody, but you don't want to worry them, especially my mum being in South Africa, so she's so far away. It was middle of COVID, there was no way she could have come here. So I used for myself, having studied hypnotherapy, used a lot of sort of mindfulness techniques to sort of really just kind of bring myself back into the moment. And when my brain was going too far ahead of myself, worrying about what might happen. They do say 90% of what you worry about actually never happens. But, so it was about me reminding myself of that and just bringing myself back and just waiting until that diagnosis. And when I had it, about educating myself. But that's not to say, that you don't have those days where you freak out completely, and that's okay too. But yeah, that worked for me, was educating myself and reading as much as I could from the right sources. As I say, be careful of Google. You've got to watch where you get your information from sometimes.
Thank you. And that is incredibly insightful, and I very much appreciate, and I'm sure everyone is watching, how sometimes difficult that can be to kind of relay everything back to when you were first diagnosed. So I think really valuable pieces, and in particular, the two aspects from yourself, Cecilia, of educating yourself is really important, but we also appreciate that that can be really difficult if you're still waiting for a diagnosis. That can also be really difficult if you don't know where to tap into to educate yourself, and where do you even begin?
Yeah.
So that's where I guess we can come in, and services like ourselves, who you can simply give us a call, chat anything through, even before a diagnosis, even if it's just something that you've just felt that you've read up on and you think, oh, I might have symptoms, you know, give us a call on the helpline, drop us an email. And I think another part about possibly anxiety in any stage, I think, of blood cancer, but particularly when you're waiting for results, is the timelines, is the wait. And Jem, I don't know if I can kind of speak for us both here, but we certainly hear and feel that through the support service team on quite a number of different kind of mediums, where people will come to us and they've maybe went to GP with symptoms, or they've just had a routine blood test and it's maybe shown some abnormalities that need further investigation. But that further investigation, sometimes that wait can just feel so long, so torturous, and really, you know, would make anybody feel anxious. But if you're already feeling anxious, that's just a whole other level. So I don't know if there's anything, Gemma, that you want to add, that perhaps services or who people can reach out to help support of that over that kind of period of anxiety, waiting for tests or diagnosis.
I think it's a tricky one, because if you're waiting for a diagnosis, there is this gap, and actually we were talking about it earlier today, thinking about how we can support the community who haven't yet been diagnosed. And we can't give specific support, but we can give support around process and sometimes timescales and what the expectations of individuals should be. Because I think if you know that there is a particular timeline, at least you know you're not waiting for undue cause, or for, you know, anxiety goes up when you think, why aren't they telling me something? You know, that's awful. But I think for services like we have, at least we can put some perspective on timelines and just try and support expectations of those that are going through this really, really tricky time. And of course, we do hear from a lot of people like this, and it is, if they are being referred to a haematology department, of course they're in limbo because the GP can't really help, but they're not yet in the haematology. So using resources like ourselves and the other charities around us is really important, but also just to really talk about it, to say this is worrying me. And if you don't want to worry someone close to you, then find someone that you can talk it through with. I think it's really important, because bottling it up does tend to exacerbate that whole process. So yeah, certainly we're very used to talking to people in this position, and are happy to do so.
Can I add something there? Apart from reinforcing, yes, it doesn't matter who you talk to, and often it's very helpful that it's somebody anonymous or non-judgmental. Although I must admit, some of my most successful conversations have been with complete strangers at the bus stop, because I don't have to look after them, as it were. But I don't know who said it, but one of my favourite quotes is that managing reality, however difficult, is always easier to manage than fantasy. And I think what you're describing is that there's a period in which we can catastrophize, for want of a better word. We can think worst case scenario. And one of the beauties of what you've just described is that people ringing the helpline, having support, you clarify what is reality, and you unpick and, as it were, remove that layer of fantasy that feeds anxiety that doesn't need to be there, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Makes complete sense, Jonathan, thank you. And I think as well, just to highlight the community forum, I know it's both, I think certainly Peter raised it, that he found that incredibly helpful, and we have an online community forum, if you're not aware of. We'll pop the links in, so that if you are new to Blood Cancer UK, or even if you have dabbled in reading the forum, it's a really brilliant place of sharing experiences. But often the feedback that we get is, I can't believe I didn't know about this, but also I can't believe I'm actually not alone, because it can be incredibly isolating thinking that you are waiting for tests, and that really builds anxiety, or that you're the only person with this rare condition. when actually, in fact, there is a whole community out there waiting for you. So again, the community forum here at Blood Cancer UK is a really brilliant support for anyone. Jem, I'm going to mute myself for more than 30 seconds and hand over to you, if that's okay.
That's fine. Thank you, Lauren, so much. We just touched upon this earlier and mentioned about loved ones, actually. And we had, not only have we thought about questions for this session, we've asked our community for questions for this session about their experiences of anxiety and their diagnosis. And one that did come up, and I just wanted to touch upon, is that one of our community members said, "Oh, I'm in remission now, and I don't know how to feel because my family related, I've had this treatment, whether it be a stem cell transplant like yourself, Cecilia, or chemotherapy or targeted therapy, and my family related, but I'm still concerned because either I'm concerned about it, the blood cancer coming back, or I know that one day it will." And how do you as individuals cope with that kind of calm period from loved ones, because they feel you're getting the right treatment, you're with the right treatment team, you've got great support around you, but you are still very, very concerned about your diagnosis and the future, really. So I don't know if Cecilia, do you want to answer?
Yeah, I'll say a little bit about that. Yeah, I mean, it is very much the case that, you know, I am living with blood cancer, but, you know, people think I've beaten it. So, because, you know, people at work, everyone at work knows what's been happening and what's going on. And you start coming back to work, and you know, you look fine, and you're having conversations like a normal person. I don't know, people have this perception of what you should look like, I guess. And so there is that perception of, oh yeah, you've beaten it, you're fine, you know, you can now carry on and, you know, resume life as it was before, which isn't, you know, I can understand why other people see that, and maybe and I also appreciate that they're doing that probably from a good place, because they want you to be like that, and that's fine. So I do sometimes just put in a little reminder, you know, that yes, I've won this initial battle of getting it into, you know, not technically in remission. Very good partial remission is what I have, but you know, we've got it there, and we're going to try and keep it there for as long as possible. But that at some point it will come back, and that's the thing, you know. I know that, and it's, I think somebody said in the forum, every little twinge, every little pain, or is it you know, coming back? I can totally relate to that. You do worry about these things, and for me, you know, at the end of the day, I have taken the stance of, you know, I can't not live worrying about, you know, that it might come back tomorrow. Because with myeloma, I mean, I've heard of people, and there's a Facebook support group which has been amazing. There are people there that have been living with it for 20 years, you know, who had the stem cell transplant way back when, and they've had no maintenance treatment, which I'm on now, and they've just carried on sort of living their lives. Not saying that they're, you know, in perfect tip-top condition, but you know, I don't know. It could come back next month. It could come back next year. It could come back in 5 years. But until that happens, I'm going to try not to worry about it. I'm not living in denial. I know it will come back, but I have to enjoy each day as it is. And you know, I have now even good days and bad days in terms of physical tiredness. Some days I am so knackered by 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Other days I feel like I could run a marathon. You know, it's really, really crazy. But yeah, again, I think, you know, for me, really, it is about, you know, bringing myself back, using those mindfulness techniques. And also, when I was done with the stem cell transplant and I got to that period of, okay, now we're going to put you on the maintenance treatment, I sort of went, okay, and now what do I do with my state of mind? Because you'll get the diagnosis straight away. You're like, okay, we're gonna start with this treatment, and you do the initial cycles, and then you do the stem cell harvest, and then you do the transplant, and then all of a sudden all of that's done, and you're like, okay, now what? And that's the point actually at which that I did seek some counselling. And you can self-refer yourself. I think it was Talk Plus with the NHS. And it took a little while before I got an appointment, but we had 6 sessions sort of CBT based. And it just helps you to, I think, just, you know, question your thoughts sometimes, question what you perceive as is your reality, and just remind yourself to take a step back. And that really did help me. Those 6 sessions really did help me, because I got to a point where actually I thought, oh, well, it's going to come back, so what's the point of anything? That's how I felt. And it's horrible to say it now, makes me a little bit anxious saying it, but it's you know, it is going to come back, but it might not be for many years. So I can't carry on living thinking like that every day until it happens, you know. So that for me helped, the counselling sessions at that point. Yeah.
And I guess what's really interesting when you say it, that you with the mindfulness, but you're also including, like you said before, about being informed and educated about your disease and options going forward, and knowing who to talk to. And I think that's a really important thing about information, is very powerful. Although sometimes it's really upsetting, but there's positive information as well that can really guide you through, and at least demonstrate there's options before you. And that's really important.
That's also with educating myself since then as well. I'm always watching out for, you know, what research is ongoing, what's happening in the world of myeloma treatment. I go to their info days. They've restarted doing the in-person ones as well. So, you know, going there and listening to doctors and professors talking about what's happening, I also kind of comfort myself with the thought that when it does come back, there is going to be another line of treatment waiting, and that there are so many different avenues that I can take, different drug combinations that they can use, maybe another stem cell transplant. If I want to put myself through that again, I don't know, but you know, there are options as well. So don't lose sight of that whilst, you know, and I speak only from myeloma, and I don't know much about other blood cancers, but I think that many of them now, whilst they might not be curable, are quite highly treatable, and there are constantly new medications coming out, new treatments coming out, research ongoing, that I have that hope and that faith that when it does come back, I'm going to have something that's going to help me beat it back down again. So, yeah.
Thank you so much. Peter, I'm just going to come over to you.
Certainly, just picking up maybe on a few of the things that Cecilia said there as well, from my experience. With mine, I'm a lower risk category. It hasn't stopped me ending up in some rather unpleasant times when infections have run out of control. I attend roughly every 12 weeks. I have to go just to check get the blood counts checked. I find when I get the text through before, I'm fine until that text comes through saying, remember your appointments next week. And then I start all my displacement activities and things again. And despite the fact that usually everything is, the counts are reasonable, there's still that always goes through your head. You think, well, what if? Picking up though on something that you said, Gemma, about, you know, when families sort of get into a groove and they're saying, yeah, everything's fine and stuff like that. I think it's a challenge with that you don't want to start worrying family and saying, you know, well, you know, something could happen, or, you know, you don't want to, because, you know, whenever it happened with me, my kids were younger and I didn't want to be adding things into the household that were distressing them. And that's why finding somebody who you can go to and talk to about things like that is quite important. I mean, I've got a hugely supportive family. I'll say, people that I know I can turn to, but there is a bit of a balancing act there, because you feel a responsibility that you don't want to be distressing, your wife and kids or other wider family members at the same time, which is, why I think it's important to find other people that you can talk to, whether it's professional counsellors, or I've got brilliant friends and colleagues that I can talk to at times about things too. Some who actually are incredibly perceptive if I'm having a really bad day, say with fatigue, or I get some unpleasant side effects from the treatment, where I can be in quite a lot of discomfort, and these people pick up almost immediately just looking at me, when others say, "Oh, you're looking great, everything must be fine." So I find it's not always just everybody assumes everything's fine. You'll get a range of people, from one saying, "Oh, everything's fine, you don't have anything to worry about. Sure, hasn't it been great for these last 5 years?" through to others who are, I think, have quite a high level of emotional intelligence and pick up on things, very, very quickly. Getting on with it, I think I've used this phrase before. I regard it, it's always going to be there with me. So I regard it as the unwanted family member or lodger in the attic. I'm not going to have them leave. So we have to find a way of coexisting with one another. So this is the way I get my head around it, is so long as it keeps its space and doesn't start making too much noise, playing the loud music at night, etc. We have to learn to live with each other, and that was part of my way of getting my head around it. Is I can't ignore it, but I can't let it take over. And absolutely what Cecilia was saying earlier, I'm just going to get on and live the best life I can. Things are different post-diagnosis, there's no question, but there's no reason why I can't get on and do the things I like and do the things I enjoy. And I've been more aware of actually trying to take time out to do that. And I'll tell you something out there. Sometimes people feel very selfish if they're trying to be kind to themselves. You do have to be kind to yourself, because if you're not kind to yourself, it actually starts impacting on your overall mental well-being, and that actually then starts impacting on the other, your loved ones around you as well, which you mightn't be aware of. So, a tip that I would give: do take time and be kind to yourselves.
Thank you, Peter. I'm going to just ask, I'm thinking about another family member scenario. Now, we have Cecilia and Peter here who are very open about talking about their diagnosis and their treatment and their concerns, and they find their way of coping, which is incredible. But we did have a question regarding a carer, a partner of a blood cancer patient who has a diagnosis but doesn't want to talk about it, and therefore isn't keeping their partner updated with treatment plans or anything, and it's actually making the carer feel more anxious. And I wondered, Jonathan, if you had any comment regarding, sorry, this is a tricky one, isn't it? So I'm going straight to Jonathan, and probably Lauren as well, but we do hear this quite often. It does come through that carers come through to us on the support line and say, "Oh, I don't know what's going on. I'm so anxious. They don't want to tell me anything. I can't go to the consultations because I'm not allowed at the moment because of COVID, or they're not being told," or something like that. And I just really to sort of just mention that not everyone does want to talk.
Yeah, I'll be a bit like a politician answering that question, and I'll answer a different question, but that will lead into that answer. It's just I want to reinforce, having worked with so many cancer counselling agencies, the time that most people refer for counselling, self-refer, is that very period of mismatch. It's when the treatment's finished and they do not understand, why do I feel so bad when everyone around me is celebrating? And so often what comes out is that it's almost like a backlog, because when you are having the treatment, something's happening and you're completely focused on, all your resources are focused on getting through that. And the family, meanwhile, has been watching and processing how does it feel and their anxieties and so on. But when you've been going through the treatment yourself, it's like somebody suddenly pulled the plug. You know, when you're no longer going to appointments, you're no longer being checked and everything else. And there's a kind of backlog of emotional or psychological processing or whatever. So there is this mismatch, but also picking up, I think, a little bit on what you were saying, Peter, as well, that, and that leads into the answer, I hope, to your question, Gemma, is that actually sometimes we can say, for instance, be concerned not to upset other family members. But the reality is what we're actually doing is being ourselves. If I'm a parent, I'm taking care of the children by not upsetting them. I'm actually protecting them from something that I think would hurt them. And I think sometimes it's a perspective, it's how you see it, that it's actually a very positive thing to do. And it reinforces I'm still me, I'm still a dad or whatever it is, you know, I'm still a parent. And that's what I'm doing. And I think a lot of the things that people do are about carrying on living, like you were saying, Cecilia. And it's all those things that if you can get back a sense of, but I have to live anyway, it builds your resilience and your robustness. But that's given me long enough to realize that what I want to do, Gemma, is tell a story about two particular people, a husband and wife in a very traditional, as it were, relationship. And I was contacted as a counsellor by the wife, who came to see me and said that she was really concerned that her husband, ever since he'd been diagnosed, had locked himself away in his study, which I still see a study as an inside man shed, if you see what I mean, as opposed to an outside one. He'd locked himself away in the study and he wouldn't come out and he wouldn't talk to her, and she didn't know what was happening, she didn't know how he felt, and she was really terrified that he couldn't deal with it. By chance, I mentioned, well, maybe he'd like to come and talk with us together, and he did. And when he came in with a third party present, he was able to explain that he was not avoiding, that he'd always been in that traditional relationship, the provider, the person who dealt with everything, the bank accounts, the lot, and that what he'd been doing in his study was producing this massive handbook, which was all about how do you write a check? What are the bank account numbers? What are the passwords on the computer? The insurance will need renewing on such and such a date. And he described it as, this is my way of carrying on, taking care of those things when I've gone. And once she realized that, and he said, I've only got about a week and it'll be finished. And sure enough, like a week later, he came out of his study and they spent 24/7 together from then on. And there was something about all they needed was to just share with each other, to communicate, to let each other know. And for her to understand, far from locking himself away, he's actually being himself. Mm. I look after these things. That's what I'm doing. Even though I know I might not be able to, I'm finding the best way. And I hope that goes some way to answer the question.
It really does. And I think what's really interesting about it as well is, and what we understand, there's no definitive time point where people either want to talk or want to talk to someone, or even engage in any kind of service, support, counselling or anything. So that's a really important, I think there's, we know that children are only ready when they're ready to do certain time points, certain, developmental jumps. And I think it's the same for all of us. We have our own internal timing and no one can sort of dictate that. And that's why it's good to be aware of it, I guess, as well. I can see that I've been talking a long time, Lauren, and I just wanted to briefly say, because I thought you would be brilliant to talk about any the sorts of therapies with the team. But there's one thing we did mention, I thought just really quickly, I wonder if I could just speak about the anxiety of people that have been shielding since the start of the pandemic and taking that first step, and thought maybe actually probably most of us can have a little bit of insight or advice or guidance, advice from obviously the patients, guidance from our team about you know, different people's, I guess, barriers from stepping out after shielding or potentially doing that. I don't know if whether Cecilia wanted to say how she felt about that.
Yeah, I'm happy to start on that one. I totally understand the comfort of being in your own home, not mingling with people who might be, you know, carrying not just COVID, you know, anything really, because coming out, especially from a stem cell transplant, your immune system is completely wiped out. The maintenance treatment I'm on also hits it. I'm quite often, the neutrophil numbers are quite low. So, you know, I do have to be careful. But this question actually did come up in our support group not too long ago, where, you know, somebody is like, you know, they're just scared to sort of take that first step, get out there. I sort of held back answering, and a few other people sort of jumped in, and the resounding response from most of those that did chip in was, you can't live your life in a bubble forever. You know, at some point it is about getting out, and yeah, I mean, I don't go to super crowded places, so I just have a think about where I'm going. So if you're having trouble having that first step, go for a walk in a park where you know you're not going to see many other people. I tend to make sure that if I am in a place where there are quite a few people, I try to keep my distance. I'll go shopping early Saturday morning to make sure that I'm not there at the peak rush hour. And also, I mean, I don't wear a mask, but if you felt comfortable better wearing a mask, then for sure wear it. I mean, nobody's going to look at you twice now after COVID. I mean, I think when prior to COVID, after stem cell transplant, you were told to wear a mask if you went out, and everybody probably looked at you funny, but now you don't have that problem anymore. And you can get really, really good masks as well. I've got the ones that actually filter the air coming in as well as, so that gave me, you know, in the beginning when I first started going out, gave me that little bit of extra confidence as well, that I'm okay, because even if somebody does have something, I'm good. So yeah, it's a difficult one, because I understand the comfort of being at home, knowing you're sort of safe there. But at some point, yeah, you've got to step out of the bubble and start again to sort of to live your life a little bit, but with caution. Yeah.
And I think it's the individual's, you know, as you say, it's the comfort of that individual choice, isn't it? Because if you're not comfortable, then your anxiety will be raised again, and we're not, you know, we very much understand that. How about you, Peter?
Well, again, it's about a year now since I first came out of isolation. I was pretty well kept locked up, other than going to hospital appointments and out for walks for 2 years. And then May 2022 started coming out. I must admit, one of the things I found difficult to deal with was actually being around people again and adapting to that. I had a little bit of anxiety around that, but that quickly passed as I started mixing more. I actually, unfortunately, did catch COVID when I eventually traveled, and just for a bit of reassurance, everything fell into place when that happened with me. The vaccination certainly helped. I got initially the antibody treatment within 12 hours of me registering the positive test, and everything just absolutely fell into place, and it was manageable. I've definitely had worse infections. I actually caught it again traveling. This time I'd gone to South Korea. This was a few weeks ago, and this time I got the new antivirals, which were phenomenal. Again, within 12 hours of the positive test, everything fell into place. So, you know, it's something we're going to have to live with. I can't pretend it won't happen. You take what precautions you can. While I was traveling out there, I was wearing masks and things like that, but you can't absolutely avoid everything. Reassurance I would give, though, is the vaccinations, and I'm now in my 7th, are from my perspective as somebody with an immunocompromised system, did actually work, and the additional treatments I got really helped, and the NHS absolutely fell into place. No complaints about that. It was phenomenal, and my clinical nurse specialist was an absolute star with that, just double checking everything was going on in the background. So we do have to get out there, and live with it. What I would say is a lot of us are immunocompromised anyway. COVID's one thing. We're having to be careful about so many other things. Since my diagnosis, there's things I can't eat anymore because there is, potential risk of infection and things with that. I have to be very careful around every flu season. And in fact, when I got very seriously ill in 2018, I got that Australian flu, and then unfortunately that completely unraveled, and I developed sepsis ultimately. So we're living with these infections anyway, but let's live with them and not let things take over. COVID was completely different. It was something that was unknown. It was a new infection. It took us a while to understand, but it's something that's ever evolving. I think, well, I'm not a medic, but I think if you look at most of these things, they evolve to be less pathogenic as they evolve because they don't like killing their host to survive ultimately. But I know I'm not qualified to say that, but I think if you look at these, and I have done various research looking at things just out of interest, that's the sort of thing you find. So, but as I say, it is intimidating stepping out for the first time, but we do have to find a way of living with this, and it's about quality of life, balanced life, etc. I personally didn't want to stay locked up any longer. I'm quite gregarious and I enjoyed going out. I remember that first cup of coffee. It was just phenomenal when I could actually go and have a cup of coffee. I was sitting outside at the time, best cup of coffee I've ever tasted. It was actually quite an emotional thing. But again, talk to people, about these fears too.
Absolutely. Lauren, I'm going to hand over to you because I'm going to be timekeeper, and it's probably due to me that there's 7 minutes to go. So I think could we squeeze in one more question and then our finishing comments? Is that okay? Thank you.
Yeah, that sounds perfect. And actually, if we can, I'd like to at the tail end, we've got some really helpful quotations, if you like, or tips that their community have sent in on what's helped them, little aspects around anxiety. So I think that's really powerful actually to finish on that. Excuse me. You've been muted for so long that the throat goes dry. It's ridiculous the minute you go live. So just very quickly, I think one of the things that we are asked about, a huge amount on the support line is, where can I go for help? It's all very well as, giving that reassurance that anxiety is a normal feeling, if you will, through any part of living with a chronic or an acute or a new illness, in particular, something so complex as a blood cancer that can very much, emit and relapse throughout your lifetime. But I wonder if there's maybe some food for thought here, and actually I'm going to reach out to anybody that's watching the session live tonight or in a recorded version, even if you wanted to get back in touch at a later time, but possibly if there's been anything that's been particularly helpful for you in terms of managing anxiety. Now, that anxiety can come in whatever shape or form, whether that be a COVID anxiety, whether that be waiting for test results, that scan anxiety, that we hear that phrase, waiting for the scan results to come in. So if there is anything that's been really powerfully helpful to yourself, doesn't matter how small, doesn't matter how silly that seems, it would be really lovely if you could pop it in the comments in our Facebook section or just below the live video. That would be really lovely, just so we can share and take tips and hints from each other. I also wondered if there's anything, just very briefly from the panel, if there's any just kind of one thing that springs to mind about small changes that you think you could offer as advice to help our well-being and support when we're dealing with anxiety. Jonathan, can I push that one to you if that's okay, just very quickly and firstly?
I'm going to say two things, but one One is that I think the emphasis is on small changes. And funnily enough, what we were just talking about there, what was being talked about, it's not unique to blood cancer. So many people have felt isolated and are now scared to go out because the world was presented as scary. And the way through this is not so much about reducing the scare as increasing the confidence, which I think both Cecilia and Peter talked about, where it might sound too small a step, but there's something almost like, okay, you don't want to go out. Next time you see the postie coming to the door, open the door and just say hello and take the parcel. Next time you see somebody, if you have a garden and you see the neighbour out in the garden, go out and speak to them. Invite somebody into your home, just in very, very small ways, build up. But the other thing I would do is, in terms of resource, is I would recommend any article by Peter Harvey, who's a retired sort of clinical psychologist, but or if you Google, if you have access to the net, if you Google Peter Harvey, when the treatment finishes or when the treatment ends, all that we've talked about and more stuff about how to deal with anxiety, how to deal with living with uncertainty and so on, it's all in there. And I would really recommend, if people have the time, and it was the absolutely most popular item on the website that we put up on what was the Cancer Counselling Trust, that the feedback was amazing. Like people said, he understands, he gets it. So I'm going to recommend that.
Brilliant, thank you, Jonathan. And if I can limit us to 1 minute very quickly, 30 seconds each, no pressure, to any small changes that you can advise our community watching tonight about how to look after your well-being and anxiety, anything that's worked for you.
I'll jump in quickly with mine. Find a hobby. For me, I started to make cheese, which is a very random thing, but it's a process and it takes hours to make one, and I'm focused on that in that time. I'm not thinking about blood cancer, I'm not thinking about anything else, I'm focusing on the process. And for me, that works, that focus. So any hobby doesn't need to be making cheese, but give it a go if you want to, because it's actually quite fun.
Yeah.
Absolutely endorse that. Do something that you enjoy. For me, it was taking photographs or sitting down watching your favorite movie, and take the time to actually sit and watch it. Allow yourself that block of time where everything else is parked. The other thing is you could get a dog. I must admit, my dog has always been such great company, and there's always the excuse to walk and things like that as well. But yes, things that work for me, my photography and my dog, and I could combine the two, going walking and taking photographs while walking her.
Brilliant, thank you everyone, and what I think a really powerful session. Thank you for your time. How quick can an hour go by when you've got lots to talk about? I think this is a topic we could talk about for a long time. Jem, I don't know, just for the last kind of minute and a half, if we want to maybe share some of the quotes that, just to end on a high and positive note, just like our panel have shared there, some people within our community have given their tips and hints about what has helped them. So I'll maybe start. One that I really loved actually was from a person, what helps me cope when I think about it is really just a timely random act of kindness. So perhaps a smile or a friendly word from someone, to receive a card or even a letter from a loved one, or indeed a phone call and email that's a little bit out the blue. Yeah. So again, very simple acts that just can really turn your day around.
Yeah, and I've got one that's really good actually. Saying no, not feeling guilty about it. I do make sure I balance this carefully with making sure I'm not isolating myself. However, I'm much better at knowing my own body, and if the thought of something is making me anxious, then I know it's not the right time, and accepting bad days and which we've talked about, and being honest about this with friends and employers, and also swimming, which is a great hobby as well. So, I mean, that we will put all these on, they're so good. And just a massive thank you to each and every one of you for being on the panel. I really hope this will engage lots more people to talk with us and peer support through the forum, obviously the support line and our social media channels as well, and our emails. But massive thank you to Cecilia, Peter, Jonathan and Lauren.
Thanks for having me.
And you too, Gemma.
Oh, pleasure. It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much. It's been a really brilliant session.
Any more questions that anyone has, or you want to continue the conversation, do pop on over to our online community forum where we can, answer any questions, and indeed everyone can meet one another.
Lovely. Thanks a lot. Bye.
Bye, folks.